The Blade itself, Joe Abercrombie. This is a modern epic fantasy that feels like a hard-edged character drama set in a rough, war-scarred world. Dark fantasy is not the same thing as horror. Horror aims for fear and dread as the main experience. Dark fantasy keeps fantasy at the center, then adds moral pressure, sharper consequences, and a colder view of power. The mood can be bleak without trying to scare you. I use 3 simple filters for choosing a first dark fantasy book. First, pace. Some books are fast and easy to enter, like The Lies of Locke Lamora or The Last Wish. Second, intensity. Some books keep the darkness in the background, while others raise the emotional weight, like The Poppy War. Third, density. Some books are straightforward and scene-driven, while others are built from bigger ideas, like The Darkness That Comes Before. I will name 8 books, explain the kind of reading experience each one creates, and then give you a simple starting plan. You can pick by mood, not by labels. If you want cynical humor and sharp character work, use The Blade itself as your anchor. If you want military grit, use The Black Company. If you want political scale, use A Game of Thrones. If you want the harshest edge, use Prince of Thorns. No spoilers, just practical choices. The Lies of Locke Lamora, Scott Lynch. This is a crime-driven fantasy that reads like a sharp caper in a city that feels lived in, stylish, and a little dangerous. The darkness here is mostly social. Greed, pressure, and consequences create tension without asking you to sit inside relentless despair. The prose is confident and witty, but the world never feels soft. Many readers who say they want dark fantasy really mean they want edge and stakes, plus momentum. This is that. It is an excellent choice if you want a book that feels clever and propulsive while still giving you a darker worldview than classic heroic fantasy. It is also a safe start if you are nervous about grim books because the voice keeps you engaged. Another reason it works as a first pick is how clear it is about what it is doing. You are not asked to memorize a massive family tree, and you are not asked to decode dense philosophy. You get a strong setting, a sharp tone, and a page-turning structure. If you finish it and want something darker in the moral sense, step to The Blade itself. If you finish it and want something darker in the war sense, step to The Black Company. If you want folklore shadows with quick wins, step to The Last Wish. The Blade itself, Joe Abercrombie. This is a character-first epic fantasy where the tone is dry, the humor is black, and the world feels bruised rather than shiny. People often call it grim-dark, but the real hook is clarity. The writing is direct, scenes have weight without being overwritten. The book is dark because it refuses easy moral labels, not because it tries to shock you. If you want to start dark fantasy without losing the feeling of adventure, this is a strong first step. You can read it for the voice alone. It is also a great choice if you usually avoid older fantasy because the style feels distant. This one reads modern without feeling trendy. A useful way to approach it is to treat the first volume as a tone sampler. Notice how tension is built with ordinary conversations, not just action scenes. Notice how humor keeps the darkness readable. If you want a similar level of sharpness but with a heist engine, pair it with The Lies of Locke Lamora. If you want a version that is more military and stripped down, follow it with The Black Company. If you want the big political machine version of dark fantasy, A Game of Thrones is the next level of scale. The point is to pick the kind of darkness you enjoy living with for hours at a time. The Black Company, Glenn Cook. This is a military fantasy told in a plain-spoken voice, like field notes written by someone who has seen too much and kept walking anyway. The darkness is practical. It comes from war routines, compromises, and the way survival turns into habit. If you want dark fantasy that feels historically grounded, this is a key foundation. The style matters. Cook writes with economy, which makes the world feel real, and it also makes the book easier to enter than many large epics. You do not need to track endless backstory to feel the pressure. You just need to accept that this world is messy, and that people do what they must to keep moving. This is also a great choice if you want your dark fantasy to feel like professional life, not like prophecy. The characters are defined by duty, fatigue, and the need to make decisions with limited information. That is a very specific kind of darkness, and it is different from horror. If you like this, you may also like A Game of Thrones for a different kind of realism, the realism of institutions and politics. If you want a darker voice with more modern cynicism, go to The Blade itself. If you want something more intense and emotionally heavy, go to The Poppy War. Use this book as your baseline for grit. The Last Wish, Andrzej Sapkowski. This is a short story collection that blends folklore, monster hunting, and dry humor in a world that feels medieval, messy, and morally complicated. Short stories lower the intimidation factor. You can read one piece, stop, and still feel satisfied. The darkness is present, but the tone stays readable. This is also a practical way to discover what kind of dark fantasy you actually like. Some readers want long political arcs. Others want tight episodes with atmosphere. This book gives you quick completions, which makes it ideal if you are busy or if you are rebuilding your reading habit. Another benefit is pacing control. If you are unsure about darker material, you can take breaks naturally between stories. You can also sample the humor. Dark fantasy often becomes easier when there is a little dryness in the voice, because it keeps the mood from collapsing into bleakness. If you like the episodic format and want something with more war grit, go to The Black Company. If you want faster, more modern caper energy, go to The Lies of Locke Lamora. If you want a big political map, go to A Game of Thrones. This is a gentle entry that still respects the darker edges of the genre. A Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. This is a sprawling political epic, where families, institutions, and geography shape the experience more than any single heroic quest. It is dark fantasy in the sense that power is treated as a system, not as a trophy. Decisions echo. Alliances matter. The world feels lived in and expensive, like a long-running prestige drama built from history rather than fairy tale rules. Choose this if you want immersion and you are happy to settle into a large cast. The darkness comes from how realistic the incentives feel. People make choices for security, status, and survival. That realism creates a colder tone than classic adventure fantasy. This is not the best first pick if you mainly want speed. For speed, go to The Lies of Locke Lamora. It is also not the best first pick if you want simple world building. For a cleaner entry, go to The Blade itself, or The Black Company. When it works because the scope is so broad that every chapter can feel like a different angle on the same world. If you want the most mainstream entry to dark fantasy that still feels weighty and adult, this is the obvious choice. If you like it and want something even denser and more philosophical, the darkness that comes before is the next step in complexity. The Poppy War, R.F. Kuang. This is a war-focused fantasy that reads with the intensity of a historical epic, mixing training, strategy, and the psychological cost of conflict. It is dark because it is serious about consequences. The tone is not cozy, the pacing is strong, but the emotional weight rises as you continue. This is a good match if you like modern, clear prose and you want to feel the pressure of a world changing under stress. It is also a good match if you do not want your darkness to be purely cynical. Here, the darkness often feels like escalation and cost. Practical advice. Plan your reading sessions so you have decompression time. Dark fantasy can be absorbing, and this one can feel intense. If you prefer lighter darkness, start with The Lies of Locke Lamora, or The Last Wish instead. If you want gritty realism but less emotional intensity, start with The Black Company. If you want political scale rather than war intensity, start with A Game of Thrones. If you do choose this as your first dark fantasy, it helps to keep your expectations clear. This is not a comfort read. It is a strong, controlled, high-stakes experience that rewards attention and pacing. Prince of Thorns, Mark Lawrence. This is a fast, brutal dark fantasy built around a highly intense voice and a constant sense of danger in a broken medieval landscape. It is a warning label book. Some readers love the speed and the ruthless energy. Other readers hate the experience because it feels emotionally abrasive. There is no shame in either reaction. If you are new to dark fantasy, do not start here unless you already know you like harsh material. A better ladder is The Lies of Locke Lamora for momentum, then The Blade itself for cynicism and moral ambiguity. Then decide if you want to go more intense. If you want darkness that comes from institutions and politics, rather than from constant abrasion, A Game of Thrones is the alternative. If you want grounded war grit and a professional tone, The Black Company is the alternative. Think of this title as an optional branch. It is here for readers who want the sharpest edge in the list and who value speed over comfort. If you try it and bounce, it does not mean dark fantasy is not for you. It may only mean you prefer a different kind of darkness. The Darkness That Comes Before, R. Scott Bakker. This is a dense, philosophical epic fantasy where the darkness comes from ideas, institutions, and the way belief shapes violence. It asks more patience than the other picks here. The cast is large, the world building is heavy, the tone is uncompromising. If you want dark fantasy that feels like a grand, cold history of a world, this is the doorway. The best approach is expectation management. Read in longer sessions. Keep a simple note of factions and places, not to study, but to reduce friction. The reward is that the darkness feels thematic rather than decorative. If you want to work up to it, use the rest of this list as a ladder. Start with The Blade itself for moral ambiguity in a modern voice. Try A Game of Thrones for political scale. Then come here when you want heavier ideas and a slower burn. This is not the best first pick if you want fast payoffs. For fast payoffs, The Last Wish and The Lies of Locke Lamora are better. This is the choice for readers who want their dark fantasy to feel like serious history and philosophy wearing fantasy clothing. The Black Company, Glenn Cook. This is also the best reference point for comparing darkness levels across your options because it sits in the middle of the spectrum. Here is a simple tone map using only the books in this list. For fast and readable darkness, go to The Lies of Locke Lamora. For episodic folklore flavor and quick completions, go to The Last Wish. For cynical humor and modern character focus, go to The Blade itself. For military grit with a professional tired tone, go to The Black Company. For political scale and long immersion, go to A Game of Thrones. For intense war weight and modern pacing, go to The Poppy War. For the harshest, most abrasive edge in this set, go to Prince of Thorns. For the densest and most philosophical darkness, go to the darkness that comes before. This is the main point. Dark fantasy is not one thing. It is a range of experiences. If you pick by intensity and density, you avoid the common mistake of buying a book that is technically dark but wrong for your mood. Use this map, pick one starting point, and then you can climb or soften the tone based on how you feel after the first book. A Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. Before you commit, do a comfort check, because dark fantasy has different kinds of weight. Ask what you want to feel after a reading session. If you want energized and entertained, start with The Lies of Locke Lamora. If you want compact episodes and a sense of folklore shadows, start with The Last Wish. If you want thoughtful cynicism with clear prose, start with The Blade itself. If you want gritty realism without constant shock, start with The Black Company. If you want to be absorbed by a massive world and a slower rhythm, start with A Game of Thrones. If you want modern pacing with heavier emotional intensity, consider The Poppy War. 2 warnings. First, do not confuse intensity with quality. Prince of Thorns is intense, but that does not make it the right entry point. Second, do not confuse density with intelligence. The darkness that comes before is dense and philosophical, but it is not a test you must pass to belong in the genre. A good reading plan respects your limits. Dark fantasy works best when you choose the kind of darkness you can carry, not the kind you think you are supposed to tolerate. The Blade itself, Joe Abercrombie. Here is a simple beginner plan that keeps momentum and gives you control over intensity. Week 1, choose either The Lies of Locke Lamora for a fast hook or The Last Wish for short self-contained sessions. Week 2, step into a more clearly dark tone. Choose The Blade itself for cynical humor and moral ambiguity in a modern voice, or choose The Black Company for grounded military grit and an economical style. Week 3 is your big commitment choice. Pick A Game of Thrones if you want political scale and long immersion. Pick The Poppy War if you want war intensity and modern pacing. After that, decide if you want to explore the edges. If you want the harshest, most abrasive branch, try Prince of Thorns. If you want the densest, most philosophical branch, try The Darkness That Comes Before. That is the whole strategy. Start with momentum, then raise darkness, then raise scale or intensity, then explore extremes if you actually want them. Dark fantasy is easiest when you treat it like a menu, not a rite of passage. Pick the experience you want, and you will read more, finish more, and enjoy the genre more consistently.